As tensions continue to escalate in the Middle East, many people are saying it's a binary conflict between good and evil, although good and evil changes depending on who you talk to. Who would have thought that a person advocating for shades of grey and nuance would be Andrew Tate? Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom, where we will be open to all information, all possibilities, all speculation before doing our level best to find a pathway through that respects our individual freedom, our collective freedom, the right for other people to hold different opinions, and the fact that if we're ever to achieve anything other than this period of decline, disintegration, conflagration, war, and hatred, we're going to have some unusual conversations, such as the one between Piers Mورgان and Andrew Tate on Piers' show quite recently. Many people were struck by Andrew Tate's position and his ability to hold that position when talking about the escalation of events in the Middle East and his ability to hold a particular line and unwillingness to answer certain questions, while interestingly, if you ask me, and let me know if you agree with this in the comments in the chat, acknowledging that there are grey areas. Now, in the last few years, there's no question that our cultural space has changed. More division, more loathing, more hatred, more people getting censored, more people getting cancelled. Have a look at how Andrew Tate handles this conversation and put aside what your particular opinion of Andrew Tate is for a moment, whether you're a top G fan or someone that thinks that Andrew Tate is a stain on our culture, and ask yourself, is Andrew Tate making reasonable points or is Andrew Tate way out of line? Let's go through this together, and as well we'll be including some commentary from the Times of Israel, who talked about some of Netanyahu's policies and how they potentially contributed to an escalation of violence, as well as a piece that suggests that deep state interest within Israel potentially and allegedly contributed to Hamas's funding. Astonishing though that is to say out loud. Certainly what it helps us to do is acknowledge that this is a very complicated political situation. Just so you know what my personal opinion is, terrorism and the violent murder of people in order to pursue political goals is disgusting and appalling. The bombing of civilian populations is appalling. I don't know how we're going to navigate our way through this, and yet surely we must try together. As I always say, if you have a particular spiritual, religious, ideological or national allegiance, I respect that. And one thing I've learned in the conversations I've had around this issue is it's very difficult to change someone's mind. If they have a particular allegiance to Judaism or Israel or Zionism, or a particular allegiance to Islam or Palestine, it's very unlikely, and I would actually say inappropriate, to try to tamper with people's feelings. And yet we must somehow try to find a way to frame this issue that doesn't deny any possibility of a peaceful solution. Must we? Let me know in the comments. Let's have a look at the conversation.
I want to turn to the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. What is your view of this war?
I think when you call it a war, you're doing a disservice to the people who are having their limbs blown off by some of the most advanced technical weaponry on the planet. It is a genocide and it is disgusting. And it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you fall on. When you observe a genocide in front of your very eyes, you should be disgusted.
Which side is waging genocide?
The Israelis are genociding the Palestinians, and you know it as well as everybody else does. That. Well, then it seems like your bosses are not allowing you to know it.
What do you think of what Hamas did on October the 7th?
Why are you starting the story in the middle, Piers?
I just asked you about the wider war.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we live in a time where a person who a little while ago would have been regarded as almost a positive thinking guru and pickup artist is now discussing Israel and Palestine with a prominent news journalist. Obviously, this issue is so contentious that some people just don't want to hear anything other than that was a terrorist attack, and whatever response Israel have is entirely legitimate and appropriate. It's their Pearl Harbor, it's Israel's 9/11, and other people think that this is an unconscionable genocide. Whenever there's an issue where opinions diverge so strongly, it's an indication that there must be complexity and there must be room for new perspectives. Have a listen to this. Part of the irony in Netanyahu's promise to eradicate Hamas is that politicians like him have long helped nurture the organisation in an attempt to undermine the Palestinian struggle. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas, Netanyahu reportedly told a meeting of Likud Knesset members in 2019. This is the source of this alleged conversation. Brigadier General Yitzhak Segev who was the Israeli military governor in Gaza in the early 1980s, told a New York Times reporter that he had helped finance the Palestinian Islamist movement as a counterweight to the secularists and leftists of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Fatah Party led by Yasser Arafat, who himself referred to Hamas as a creature of Israel. Again, when a nation is in grief, as both of these people surely are now, Israel as they are as a result of the events of October the 7th, the Palestinian people as they surely are because of the ongoing oppression and occupation, it's very difficult to bring forward ideas that suggest that there is additional complexity to a situation that most of us struggle to get our heads around. But one thing that seems recognizable to me, even from the Pied Piper strategies deployed in American politics, is sometimes in order to create tension and division, a political power will support opponents that are preferable to their cause. Now, I know there's a world of difference between supporting radical Republicans in state elections in order to colour the Republican Party in an extremist hue and supporting Hamas, but this is precisely what's being alleged here. And there's no question that destabilising this region, and in particular destabilising Gaza and the West Bank, is advantageous to certain political interests within Israel. I hope that's not the same as saying Israel as a whole, because it seems that, of course, Israel is a nation of millions of people with various political and religious interests and degrees of political interest within the nation. So it seems that, like within the United States, there are elites and establishment interests that perhaps, certainly according to this, behave in ways that are surprising, unusual and worthy of scrutiny. The Israeli government gave me a budget, the retired Brigadier General confessed, and the military government gives to the mosques. Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation. Avner Cohen, a former Israeli religious affairs official who worked in Gaza for more than 2 decades, told the Wall Street Journal in 2009. We can't continue to deliver this groundbreaking, world-shaking content without you, who we love, obviously, and our partners. Today, it's Bioptimizers. Magnesium breakthrough in particular from Bioptimizers, a true game changer in the quest for a better night's sleep. You sleeping okay? Unbelievably, I'm sleeping fantastically well. Prophetic dreams, clear visions. Can all of that be due to Bioptimizers magnesium breakthrough? Well, they've got a Black Friday mega sale right now. It's lasting throughout the entire month of November. The biggest discount you can get and amazing gifts with purchase are available only on my page, biooptimizers.com/brand with a code BRAND, the code BRAND. This Black Friday, choose your health and wellness over unnecessary, frivolous objects. Head over to biooptimizers.com/brand and enter the code BRAND at the checkout. 25% off, simple as that. Right, let's get back to this, shall we? Back in the mid-1980s, Cohen even wrote an official report to his superiors warning them not to play divide and rule in the occupied territories by backing Palestinian Islamists against Palestinian secularists. I suggest focusing our efforts on finding ways to break up this monster before this reality jumps in our face, he wrote. They didn't listen to him. Now, whatever you think of Andrew Tate, he's plainly not a moron. This is a working-class English person who's able to handle a particular perspective on a very complex issue. You might disagree with him. Certainly you will if you have strong ties to Israel, and of course I would be entirely respectful of that. But his ability to marshal a relatively complex argument I think is interesting, and I suppose if we're considering ways that this situation might be resolved, we're going to have to consider that it's not black and white. Certainly any point of view that's about the absolute vilification and demonization of any group of people, whether that's the Israelis as oppressive monsters or the Palestinian people and Hamas in particular as sort of subhuman, is not likely to lead to any resolution. Isn't it extraordinary too that our culture has marginalized and maligned Andrew Tate for a variety of allegations which he stringently denies and mostly portrays him as an imbecilic figure, and yet here he seems to me very competent and able to handle a conversation around an issue that many people don't want to go near.
What is your reaction to what happened on October the 7th?
Sure, I'll answer the question professionally. I do not condone the loss of human life on either side. I think anybody doing anything which directly damages civilians is disgusting and abhorrent. However, I would be an amateur if I could not sit and pretend I do not understand the motivations behind either side. This is not even me taking a side. I understand why Israel is doing what it's doing. I understand why Palestine is doing what it's doing. However, I still call the Israeli actions absolutely abhorrent and genocidal.
Okay, we're going to come to Israel's actions, I promise you. We will ask that question specifically. But in terms of what Hamas did on October the 7th, do you accept that was an act of terrorism?
It's an interesting question because once
It's not really.
It is.
It's a very straightforward
because
question.
you're the person who would have called Nelson Mandela a terrorist while he was still in jail, and one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
I wouldn't
For
have
me to
called him
answer
that.
the question, yes, you would have.
Culture moves now more quickly than it ever has, and we have to be aware of these categorizations. Myself, I don't have any problem describing massacres and kidnaps as acts of terror, but similarly, it's important to look at the origins of these conditions, and Tate's claim that even those events had a point of origin is one that's worthy of considering. Let me know in the chat what you think. Of course, Piers Morgan's position is that nothing could ever justify those acts. Curiously, what Andrew Tate subsequently does is invites Piers Morgan to take this issue on from a personal perspective, i.e. if you yourself had lost family members, if you'd had your house blown up, if you'd had your house invaded, would you be considered? And I suppose this is a question we all ask of ourselves, isn't it? And that's why I continually say, if you are directly involved, I'm not preaching to you, because if anybody went near my children, I know even from recent events where I've been subject to personal attacks, that the protection of your family becomes absolutely paramount. So I can only imagine what it would be like if that was a military attack, terrorist attacks, or whatever attack. What I am sensitive to as well is that outside of this issue, power is able to label its enemies and their violence as terroristic and abhorrent, and their own violence as rational and necessary. Even in this conversation, when it talks about the barbaric murders that took place on October the 7th, they are graphically described. The details of the drama, which are appalling, are plainly laid out. But when you just think of 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on a city, it's still brutal and disgusting and appalling. It's not as dramatic or as vivid. You don't deploy the same kind of image systems. You don't envisage the same drama. But ultimately, when Andrew Tate talks about a 15-year-old girl having her legs blown off and having lost her parents, ultimately, we're describing the same kind of situation. And isn't there going to be, if ever a solution were to be reached, and I'm certainly not imagining we're going to resolve it during the course of this video, won't it require a different type of perspective? At some point, are we going to have to say, this violence is wrong and this violence is wrong? I mean, in a way, it's similar to what we discussed when talking about American domestic politics. If you are pro-free speech, you must be pro the free speech of your opponents. If you are anti-violence, you must be against the violence that might advance your own cause. So plainly, as most people now are anti-violence, surely, a ceasefire and a cessation to hostility has to be what the world's political bodies would favour and be advancing towards together, doesn't it? Surely a ceasefire should be a priority, and creating the conditions for a de-escalation of violence should be what's being discussed.
For me to answer the question, I have to be very professional, Piers. For me to sit on the outside in Romania with no personal involvement in Israel-Palestine, it's easy for me to say, yes, it was an act of terror. However, if I was in Gaza, if I was in an open-air prison, if my family had been annihilated by bombs from the sky, if everybody I knew had suffered the loss of a loved one, if I had no chance of any kind of freedom or democracy or standard of life, would I believe it was an act of terror, or would I believe it's an act of resistance against oppression? You have to be very careful how you answer these questions.
So what do you think?
I think I understand what happens when you take people and put them in such an inhumane condition. For anybody to sit and say that you're going to take people and put them in absolutely inhumane conditions and give them no standard of life, and they're not allowed to ever fight back, or they are terrorists.
But I can agree with you.
Anyone who does that is an amateur.
I can agree with you that the plight of the Palestinians for many decades has been absolutely shameful.
So what did we think was going to happen, Piers?
No, nothing justifies what happened on October the 7th.
So what are they supposed to do?
Nothing.
So what are they supposed to do?
That was an act of medieval barbaric terrorism. Nothing justifies it.
Did they suffer acts of medieval? Did they suffer acts of medieval barbaric terrorism before that date? Yes. And it's unfortunately an eye for an eye in this world. I'm not condoning. I'm being a professional and answering to you why it happened. Give me one example.
Are they a terror group or not?
They're one team's freedom fighter, and they're deemed a terrorist
What do you think?
I think that if you lock people in an open-air prison and steal their land, they're going to retaliate.
So they're not a terror group?
I think they're going to retaliate.
In a sense, trying to achieve an objective set of labels is a fool's errand, because if that were possible, there would not be a conflict at all. If we were able to say, well, this is terrorism, that's not terrorism, that's justified violence, that's not justified violence. I think any sane person, and indeed Andrew Tate said several times that the events of October the 7th are unconscionable, and he's seen seems to me to be merely trying to provide a historic context under which such acts would be conceivable, for indeed they happened. I suppose one of the things that's difficult to accept is when either group are cast as subhuman. And I've seen very successful and very eloquent commentators say that the problem is that Hamas are a distinct group with a different mindset. And indeed, this is, I suppose, the very definition of Islamophobia, the idea that Islam in itself is a religion that valorizes violence and therefore it should be excluded from the progressive world or the democratic world. We consistently hear Islam described in terms that appear to deny it the right to exist at all. This is from the Times of Israel and offers some interesting analysis of how this situation may have escalated and what the contributory factors could have been. For years, the various governments led by Benjamin Netanyahu took an approach that divided power between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, bringing Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to his knees while making moves that propped up the Hamas terror group. The idea was to prevent Abbas or anyone else in the Palestinian Authority's West Bank government from advancing toward the establishment of a Palestinian state. Thus, amid this bid to impair Abbas, Hamas was upgraded from a mere terror group to an organisation with which Israel held indirect negotiations via Egypt, and one that was allowed to receive infusions of cash from abroad. Meanwhile, Israel has allowed suitcases holding millions in Qatari cash to enter Gaza through its crossing since 2018 in order to maintain its fragile ceasefire with the Hamas rulers of the Strip. Most of the time, Israeli policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as an asset. Far-right MK Bezalel Smotrich, now the finance minister in the hardline government and leader of the religious Zionism party, said so himself in 2015. So regarding Hamas as an asset is an extraordinary perspective given the obvious hostilities and the events of October the 7th. This is very different from saying that Israel bears responsibility for those terrorist attacks. When you look at a conflict with this deeper and as troubling history as this one, it's difficult to isolate individual components with it and not see it just as an extraordinary mess. When we spoke to Chris Hedges recently, he said that the problems in this region are typical of any colonial settler enterprise. And if you extract the unique historical and religious connection between Israel and Israeli people to that land and regard it in the same way you would South Africa or indeed the Americas themselves, many of the patterns become more observable. Again, it's difficult to not be drawn into a position where you seem to be saying either Israel doesn't have the right to exist or the Palestinian people don't have the right to exist. There seems like these strong poles that want to pull you to one of those places. How can we, as the citizens of a progressive world, resist these two poles that seem to be pulling you towards violence and extermination and condemnation and find a way to say, hold on a minute, aren't we all just human beings? Is there a way through this? Or are we all going to just tribalize to the point where none of us can do anything but hate? According to various reports, Netanyahu made a similar point at a Likud faction meeting in early 2019 when he was quoted as saying that those who oppose a Palestinian state should support the transfer of funds to Gaza because maintaining the separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So it does seem that there's some political advantage within certain quarters of Israeli government in keeping those two regions distinct and opposed, and even, extraordinary though it may sound, in allowing Hamas to somehow prosper in a limited way because it's a destabilizing influence within the region. And I suppose the reason that Andrew Tate is unwilling to say, yes, that's a terrorist attack, yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization, because by saying those things you are denying the complexity that even this article within the Israeli Times seems to allude to, that there have been points where Hamas have been fostered, facilitated, ignored and even funded in order to destabilize an already unstable region. And when you look at the complex historical context, it becomes impossible to solve this problem with either Israel are evil or Palestine is evil or neither of these sides or either of these sides don't have the right to exist. Therefore, difficult conversations where you listen intently to perspectives of people that you completely disagree with are entirely necessary. And when you look at what our culture is doing more broadly, censoring, cutting people off, shutting people down, unpersoning folk, debanking people, that's the opposite of what's required if you want anything other than the advance of centralized authority, the advance of tyranny, and the crushing of almost anybody outside of that.
They're not a terror group.
One team's terrorists is another.
Okay, we're now up to about 8. Are they a terror group?
And also, another thing I want to make clear to you, Piers.
Only Jeremy Corbyn has done this.
Done what?
Refused to answer the question.
I think that what they are doing is seemingly deemed an act of terror by the people that the terror...
Don't use weaselly words.
They're not weaselly. Of course the Israelis think they're a terror group, and of course the Palestinians think they're freedom fighters. It's stupid that you're asking the question.
Most of the civilized world thinks they're a terror group who committed an act of terrorism. It's not difficult. What they did was an act of terrorism.
And I think that if Israel continues to conduct acts of terrorism on the Palestinian people, they're going to do nothing but strengthen the reaction.
What I think is interesting about this is whether or not you agree with Andrew Tate, in this instance, the perspectives of the people of Palestine, you have to consider it somewhat valuable and important that these views and perspectives are expressed, and indeed significant that conversations between people who disagree with each other have a certain value. Increasingly, what's being created is an environment where certain views are marginalized and extracted. It's clear that how the media primarily functions is to present information in a way that makes it very difficult to have an opposing view. For example, just the chronology that Andrew Tate referred to, why are you starting this story in the middle, some of the semantics, one man's terrorist group is another man's freedom fighter. These are all arguments that outside of this highly contentious subject at this highly contentious moment, most people on the left or the right would agree with. The reason when we've been covering this issue, I've continually said if you're connected to Israel or if you're connected to Palestine, I'm not attempting to change your perspective, is because if this becomes such a highly polarized issue that there's nothing but people hating one another on either side, even people that are existing in cultural communities that are not directly affected, it seems impossible to me that we'll be able to solve this issue or many others. This war occurred at a time when the culture was starting, it seemed to me, in spite of its divisions, to form new alliances and new perspectives when it came to anti-establishment discourse. That there were people that were old school liberals, people that were on the left, people that were on the right, libertarians, anarchists, progressive people, people that were very traditional, that were starting to recognise that centralised authority had taken a stance and was pursuing an agenda that would lead to less and less individual freedom and less community power, less and less democracy, less freedom of speech, less freedom to organise, militarised police forces. All of these things were on the rise, and people were starting to understand, hey, we no longer have the luxury of the kind of tribal opposition that defined our culture for the last 10, 20 years. We're going to have to find new alliances on the periphery if indeed we are against centralised authority. But then this issue that is perhaps more historically divisive than any other exploded quite literally back into cultural life, and once again there was division. When Andrew Tate elsewhere in this conversation talks about Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, they're people that he was loosely grouped together with as countercultural figures that were anti-establishment, that were always on the edge of being cancelled. But now there are sort of public spats and pronounced disagreements precisely because of this issue. Now I know that these are only a few individuals existing within a culture, but what I'm noticing more broadly, in particular because of my own situation, is the possibility for open conversation is being increasingly foreclosed, that the conditions for censorship are being exaggerated and continually amplified. If you don't permit free speech, and in particular the free speech of people you disagree with, violence, terrorism, war, all become much more likely and much more necessary. The very idea that there are subclasses of human beings that shouldn't be included in the conversation is absurd and ridiculous and leads to ultimately more violence for all of us. Do you remember at the beginning of the pandemic where there was a brief moment where it felt like we're all in this together, and because life is sacred, any measures that are suggested are measures that we must consider? Lock us down, cancel football, cancel my business, cancel everything. As long as we protect the most vulnerable people in society and we all stick together, we have a chance. Well, the reason that idea was probably so successful is because it's true. Ultimately, if you create enclaves of oppression and enclaves of violence and localized violence and escalating tension, it does a disservice to all of us. No one can ever win this conflict, particularly if no one is allowed to openly discuss it. Whether you're talking about American politics and the difference between red states and blue states, or the Middle East and the distinction between Judaism and Islam, or indeed Christianity, there can be no victory for one side. There cannot be the absolute annihilation, homogenization, total victory for one group without becoming the very monsters that liberal democracy always claimed to fear most. Indeed, isn't the cancellation of Andrew Tate ultimately about him being a person that's outside of liberal democracy and its values, a monster of some kind? And yet here we hear him advocating for shades of grey. Whether you agree with Andrew Tate's position on Palestine or not, you have to agree with his right to express those views. It would be good, I think, to see Ben Shapiro and Andrew Tate and pro-Israeli voices and pro-Palestinian voices having to reach some kind of conclusion. Because without that, we are going to necessarily have an ongoing vicissitude of escalating violence, acts of terror, acts of war, acts of occupation, acts of annihilation. And who benefits from that? Well, according to this article, somewhere centralized power benefits from fracture and fissure, benefits from a lack of democracy, benefits from a lack of communication. So even complicated though this issue is, I think we have to look at how it maps onto a global scale. If we can't communicate openly with one another, if we're not willing to have basic principles of justice, innocent until proven guilty, open-mindedness, good faith, decent, open, transparent media, fair government that's not responding as a result of the string pulling of the corporate world, but because of the needs of the people, we are literally doomed. And the eradication of free speech is one of the first pillars that's being challenged, and I believe it's on the very precipice of falling. So whether you agree with Andrew Tate or not, the words of Andrew Tate, the concept of Andrew Tate, you have to ask yourself, do you believe in free speech or don't you? And I do. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and chats? Remember, we stream every day at these times. Let us know what guests you'd like to see us have on the show, and we'll do our level best to get them. More important than any of that, though, if you can, please stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.
هل أنت من البنائين الأحرار؟ هل أنت ماسوني؟
بشرف أنت جاي من اليمن وجاي تعمل لي مسرحيات وكذا يا زلمي، لك روح العب لك شغلة ثاني. أنا عم بسألك سؤال وكذا. ماسوني، أنا ماسوني وصهيوني وسلفي وبراغماتي وحنفركوشي وشنكليشي وحنكليشي وقنطريشي. بدك غير هيك؟
جميل.
وصهيوني.
الآن
أوكي؟
نبدأ
وبعصي.
نبدأ مسار.
يلا جاوب على سؤالي.
أوكي.